Christian Haines is an assistant professor of English at Dartmouth College, where his research and teaching focuses on American literature, but extrapolated in international context, on critical theory, continental philosophy, queer theory, and gender studies, as well as studies of utopia, and I'm insisting on apocalypse as well. His current book project, which he's in the middle of completing, is called A Desire Called America, Biopolitics, Utopia, and Literary Commons. This is a book that examines representations of bodies and biologies in 19th century and contemporary US literature. He's also researching a second book project in which his continuing work gets developed on finance, capital, and culture, which is called at the moment Finance as a Way of Life. He published essays in Cultural Critique, where he's also a co-editor of a special issue on what comes after the subject. He's published essays in Genre, Textual Practice, Criticism, and Angelaki. And his work today has to do with thinking about the contemporary relevance of Walt Whitman as a thinker of biopolitics. So today's talk, as you can see from the above, is When Liberation Coincides with Total Destruction, Walt Whitman's Biopolitics in Post-Katrina New Orleans and the Second Gulf War. So please join me in welcoming Christian Haines.
So thanks for showing up. Thanks for, I guess, for not braving the storm so much as the aftermath of the storm. It's really just went gross out there. I think Jonathan put it exactly right when he was saying that I'm thinking of Whitman as a thinker of biopolitics. There's always the question of whether or not this is part of a larger project, and I'm happy to say this isn't part of a larger project. It spins out of the book I'm completing, which has a chapter on Whitman. In that book, I think about Whitman in terms of the intersection of biopolitics and utopia. I'm trying to look at the way in which Whitman, let's say, recuperates a thinking of real democracy as opposed to formal democracy. But I was dissatisfied, even though the chapter is done, I don't want to touch it again, I was dissatisfied with the fact that I felt like I was giving short shrift to the complicity between Whitman's poetry and thinking and American exceptionalism, the way in which, in fact, is thinking of a utopia or utopia incarnate is, in fact, predicated upon, let's call it, the disaster of American exceptionalism, a very long disaster. And so this talk, in a way, spins out of that chapter as a way to account for, let's say, the simultaneous complicity and utopianism of Whitman with American exceptionalism. I'm going to start off with a video, and then I'll turn the lights up. Some of you may have seen this before.
Simply a useful journey to prove that all life is good, known, unknown, young or old, strong, able, fair, enduring, capable, rich, and when you with the earth, with freedom, law, and love.
That was a jeans commercial. This is what I do instead of teaching students literature. By the summer of 2009, there was no longer any doubt that we face a new economic crisis, a global capitalist crisis in which the wild speculations of high finance had finally come home to roost. In that moment, Levi's Jeans released a pair of commercials produced by the Portland-based advertising agency Weeden & Kennedy as part of Levi's new Go Forth campaign. Both commercials feature poetry by Walt Whitman. In one case, the poem, O Pioneers, O Pioneers, and in the other, the poem America, which is the one we just saw. The commercials aired in movie theaters, as well as during television programming, and they possessed a cinematic quality, the seductive power of which is hard to deny. I first encountered it actually before a screening of A Winter's Bone, which seemed apropos to say the least. The commercial that I played for you is in fact directed by Cary Fukunaga, best known for the directing the first season of the show True Detective, as well as for his film Sin Nombre and most recently Beasts of No Nation. Both commercials channel the kinetic energy of the bodies they capture on film. Quick cuts and close-ups of bodies in movement generate the sense of an impending event, the expectation of coming transformation, in short, a feeling of crisis. The America commercial mobilizes Whitman's poetry to stage a scene of utopian aspiration. The montage sequence weaves together a national spectacle cutting across class, gender, age, and race. It is not simply that it aggregates a diverse set of bodies representative of some multicultural imaginary, but that through the visual technique of close-ups, presenting only parts of bodies with faces frequently off screen, the advertisement suggests the possibility of a common flesh, a flesh in which differences unite without melting away. The acoustic dimension of the short film obeys a logic of what we might call mimetic reciprocation in respect to the images. When we hear the words young or old, we see two older men sitting in chat. The montage's production of unity through difference constitutes a formal analogy to the content of the poem, effecting in the visual register the equality, equal daughters, equal sons, towards which the poem's words only gesture. The sound of gunshots or fireworks and the persistent noise of what might be marching lend the commercial a quality of militancy, referencing with ambiguity both the American Revolution and the Civil War. The sound of gunshots punctuate the visual syntax. They communicate a gravitas, a pull towards some imminent yet unpresented future. This march into futurity contrasts with the slow voice that reads the poem, a slowness that does not so much contradict the speed of the images as supplement them. This logic of supplementation becomes evident when we consider the two lines of the poem that the commercial refrains from delivering. That's the final two lines of the poem. A grand, sane, towering, seated mother, chaired in the adamant of time. The stillness of seated and the deification of maternity translate the kinetic movement of the images into something like potential energy. Or to put it differently, these lines convert motion towards an uncertain future into movement in place, the stasis of eternity. This shift into the temporal mode of eternity confirms itself in a pointed way when we realize that the reading voice in the commercial is none other than Whitman's, and I mean that very literally. From a wax cylinder recording that was made in 1889 or 1890. It's the only known, relatively verified version of Whitman reading his own poetry. What better use for it? Mass media or commercial culture continues to prove itself adept at materializing in the most spectacular fashion the divine power of resurrection. Moreover, given that this poem appears in a postbellum edition of Leaves of Grass, the 1891-92 version, the Whitman that gets resuscitated is the old gray-bearded bard. It is the Whitman who, having supposedly learned the lesson of the Civil War, namely the fragility of national unity, has sacrificed the insurgent fire of his youth in favor of a circumspect wisdom, a patience born of experience. At least, so the story goes. There's this sort of long biographical tradition of thinking of Whitman's life as having two segments, one basically antebellum, one postbellum, with the idea that he sort of wised up and stopped being a radical lefty in the postbellum version, which I write quite a bit about and don't really agree with that easy narrative logic. So at this point, then, we have a reading of the poem, or the commercial qua poem, as reconciliation. From this perspective, the advertisement communicates with the past through the medium of Whitman's voice, citing historical moments, the American Revolution, the Civil War, where conflict resolves itself into unity, where disorder gives way to the grand but sane spirit of American exceptionalism. That this is conditioned by a desire to sell jeans does not annul the political content. Instead, it predicates that political content on the commodity form. The commodity form sets the stage for the reconciliation. Its powers of abstraction enable a fluid movement through social differences. In short, this commercial from Levi's Go Forth campaign labors towards a synthesis of capitalism, nationalism, and literary tradition in order to produce not so much the resolution of the 2008 financial crisis as a promise that it will be resolved at some point in the future. It constitutes a resurrection of American exceptionalism, yet another attempt to make America great again, by rendering a movement of commodified diversity into a placeholder for utopian logic of American exceptionalism. Yet, there's another reading available here. A countercurrent submerged beneath the commercial's exemplification of American exceptionalism. This other possibility, what I would call a counternational potential, signifies itself in the opening and penultimate shots where we find a neon sign half submerged reading America. We can read this image metaphorically as America being underwater, noting the economic connotations of that phrase, which range from the technical designation of an underwater mortgage to the existential economic condition of drowning in debt. That the sign flickers into illumination in the first shot suggests a liminal state, a sense of hope inextricable from crisis. This sense of crisis without resolution is also evident in the short sequence depicting a man in a suit, presumably a corporate executive, assaulted by protesters in his limo. At least a part of the commercial, then, suggests a knowledge of real social contradiction, which is to say that its images bear trace of the class relations that were the condition of possibility for the 2008 crisis in the first place. A final detail makes the submerged counternational potential of this commercial stand in even starker contrast to the promissory note of American exceptionalism. Namely, the fact that much of the commercial is shot in those parts of New Orleans that were the most deeply affected by Hurricane Katrina. And while I haven't figured it out yet, it's difficult not to think of this in a certain sense as Fukunaga testing out terrains for what would then become True Detective. So it's almost the prelude to True Detective in a certain way. With that setting in mind, the idle bodies, bodies dancing, bodies sitting, bodies not at work, take on another signification. They are the unemployed, a surplus population consigned to a marginal position in respect to the circulation of capital. Without getting too deep into the numbers, let me note that following Hurricane Katrina, unemployment in New Orleans more than doubled, reaching over 27% at one point. Even before the hurricane, unemployment rates were twice the national average, with African Americans disproportionately affected. And finally, unemployment rates, which by 2008 had actually dropped to nearly pre-Katrina levels, surged once again by August of 2009, which the Brookings Institute attributed to the onset of the recession. If the bodies of the commercial, mediated as they are by the words of the poem, testify to freedom and equality, to an idleness in which one's activity is one's own, Whitman's ethos of loafing, they also bear witness to abandonment, to a subtraction from the time of nationalist and capitalist futurity to the rise of racialized precarity. These idle bodies constitute a flesh out of place, an embodied subjectivity with no place to call home, no work to perform, and consequently vulnerable to the police violences that have systematically targeted vagrant life in the history of capitalism. There are then two aspects defining the corporeal figures in these images. On the one hand, they're supposed to incarnate democracy as such. On the other hand, they express a dystopian state of abandonment, vulnerability, and exposure. They are the embodied wreckage of a neoliberal program of disaster management. These two aspects are not mutually exclusive, but rather pinned together, yoked in a tension of the union of opposites. In other words, the site of the disaster becomes the site of renewal. The flickering sign of America thus serves as an emblem for the sheer ambivalence of this crisis. For crisis as a moment of bifurcation, an opening onto temporal alterity more likely to result in a disaster than in anything utopian. Now, my point here is not that the first reading in terms of American exceptionalism negates the second reading in terms of counternational potential, but rather that these two readings are inextricable from one another. So this isn't a good place to leave an oppositional intellectual, in other words, but that's kind of my point, is that oppositional sort of intellectual modes may not account for what this commercial does in respect to Whitman's poetry. And I'll come back to that. Exceptionalism serves as a condition for articulating counternational potential in this context. Nor is this solely a contest between utopia and catastrophe. It is also a struggle between two modes of utopianism, between what Ernst Bloch in The Principle of Hope terms concrete utopia on the one hand and abstract utopia on the other. So on the one hand, the commercial suggests an abstract utopianism insofar as it identifies the United States with a vision of the future as reconciliation that also papers over social contradiction and historical trauma in the process. This abstract utopianism serves as an ideological function in respect to the neoliberal restructuring of post-Katrina New Orleans. It amounts to an alibi for what David Harvey terms accumulation by dispossession, or the process whereby capital expands its reach and intensifies its hold by violently appropriating resources. This process can be seen very strikingly in the transformations of the real estate market in New Orleans subsequent to Hurricane Katrina. Housing prices have increased by nearly 50% over their previous values, pricing out previous residents, most notably persons of color. And the place where you find the most data on this are places that are, of course, celebrating this rise of prices, that are talking about the sort of improvement of New Orleans post-Hurricane Katrina. On the other hand, the counter-national potential of the commercial's unemployed bodies, their power to interrupt narratives of national progress and reconciliation, renders the utopian dimension concrete. It hitches the desire for utopia onto the material possibilities harbored by the present. It is irreducible to abstract utopia's functions of wish fulfillment, for instead of supposing the acquisition of an object that would satisfy a pre-existing subject, it implies a transformation of the subjects themselves. If we understand the bodies in the commercial as figures, which is to say as corporeal arrangements that gesture towards a possible future, then we might understand them as calling forth both the Occupy movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, both of course which post-date it. It is not, of course, that these figures predict the emergence of these movements, but rather that in the pathos of their flesh, they demand the invention of social forms, of social movements, capable of interrupting the logic of American exceptionalism and of bringing about justice in regards to the disaster that is Katrina, as well as the racist capitalist machine that enabled it. So, whereas abstract utopianism treats the future as an extension of the present, or a consolidation of the status quo, concrete utopianism delivers, in Fred Jameson's terms, the future as disruption. And I quote, "Disruption as novum, as restructuration and the unexpected blasting open of habits as that lateral side door which suddenly opens onto a new world of transformed human beings," end quote. Part of the difficulty here is how do you distinguish between that restructuring or blasting open insofar as it's complicit with neoliberalism's project of renovating landscapes for capital, and then on the other hand, as a, let's say, a radical leftist or a progressive politics. And I'm not sure how to do that yet, to be honest. So, although Jameson does not explicitly make the claim, I would argue that the strategy of the future as disruption implies a biopolitical theory of utopia, in which the imagination of the future depends upon transformations of bodies. Biopolitical utopianism might seem a contradiction in terms, especially for those of you who've read your History of Sexuality Volume 1 closely. But we should perhaps keep in mind Foucault's claim in the second volume of the History of Sexuality that his motivation for writing was what he termed curiosity. And I quote, "It was curiosity, the only kind of curiosity in any case that is worth acting upon with a degree of obstinacy. Not the curiosity that seeks to assimilate what is proper for one to know, but that which enables one to get free from oneself." This desire to get free from oneself is the precise point at which biopolitics and utopia overlap. To get free of oneself means not only subverting existent power relations, it means getting a new self. It predicates the utopian horizon of a new world on transformed or transforming embodied relations in this one. Foucault's curiosity reminds us that the discourse of biopolitics includes an affirmative as well as a critical mode. That's basically what my book is about. So at this point, I want to hazard a first thesis, and there's going to be 3 theses in the talk. Walt Whitman's poetry functions as a space of utopian ambivalence, a zone of oscillation between abstract and concrete utopianisms. This ambivalence articulates itself in biopolitical terms through the presentation of corporeal figures. Whereas the corporeal figures of abstract utopianisms are no more than vectors pointing towards a future of reconciliation, in concrete utopianism, the future is imminent to the body, which is to say, it is exposed to the contradictions of social existence. As such, complete utopianism promises not reconciliation, but ways of being otherwise. Now, it may strike you as an act of infidelity towards Whitman and his poetry to dwell at such length on what at the end of the day is no more than a commercial for dental Haines. Or it might just be silly to you. Yet I want to insist that fidelity towards Whitman does not depend on maintaining the consistency of his poetry, its identity, or its self-enclosure. Instead, fidelity to Whitman can only take the form of repetition, revision, and adaptation. The final sentence of the preface to the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass suggests as much. And I quote, "The proof of the poet is that his country absorbs him as affectionately as he has absorbed it." In this context of the preface, with its emphasis on the poet as quote-unquote channel of life, this line refers more to than mere aesthetic taste. It suggests that poetry does not terminate itself in the text, but extends beyond the literary corpus into the bodies of readers, and arguably also the future writers. Affection here needs to be read in ontological terms as affective relations. That is, as the pre-individual relations that compose bodies and that constitute their manners of being in the world. Affect here does not mean emotion so much as the impersonal material relations that make up a life and that enable life to change. In this Spinozist view, which I want to suggest is also a Whitmanian view, what is at stake in Whitman's desire for affectionate absorption is nothing less than a vitalization of poetry, or an understanding of poetry as a zone of indistinguishability between the word and the flesh. We witness this blurring of bodies and signifiers in many instances in which Whitman reflexively draws attention to his own activity of poetic production, only to claim the greatest poem is in the flesh of his poetic subjects. To quote from the 1855 version of the poem that would eventually be called I Sing the Body Electric, "The expression of a well-made man appears not only in his face, it is in limbs and joints also. It is curiously in the joints of his hips and wrists. It is in his walk, the carriage of his neck, the flex of his waist and knees. Dress does not hide it, so no expression is in the body, in the arrangement of the body. The strong, sweet, supple quality he has strikes through the cotton and flannel. To see him pass conveys as much as the best poem, perhaps more. You linger to see his back, and then back of his neck and shoulder side." End quote. There is already poetry in the body, already expression in the corporeal arrangement of this well-made man. His flesh is already a surplus of potential, an object worth lingering upon so as to see what may yet stir to life. Poetry thus becomes a medium of life, which is not to say that it is in itself a source of life. Instead, it functions as what we might call an amplifier, capable of operating only on the basis of a pre-existing current of life. This version of fidelity might be understood as the afterlife of Whitman's poetry. In The Task of the Translator, Walter Benjamin writes the following in regards to the term Nachleben, or afterlife, which he's talking about in terms of translation of poetic texts and other kinds of texts. "For in its afterlife, which could not be called that if it were not a transformation and a renewal of something living, the original undergoes change. Even words with fixed meaning can undergo a maturing process. The obvious tendentiousness of a writer's literary style may in time wither away, only to give rise to imminent tendencies in literary creation." End quote. Benjamin uses the term Nachleben to describe the relationship between a text and its translations, doing so in a manner that does not pose the translation as an inauthentic derivative of the original, but rather as a chance for the perfection of a literary work. Translation extends the life of a work, drawing out the imminent potentials of the original to create new actualities. Even more provocatively, translation transforms the original. For as Benjamin makes clear, Nachleben does not imply a space after life, but rather the supplementation of life. Translation brings out the potential in a text that belongs to it as its own singular excess, as that which in it is more than it. I don't believe it's a stretch to argue that Whitman and Benjamin share a common project, that of understanding literature as a biopolitical technology, a practice for extending, transforming, and fulfilling life. As Whitman writes, the greatest poet holds the consistence of what is to be from what has been and what is. He drags the dead out of their coffins and stands them on their feet. He says to the past, rise and walk before me, that I may realize you. He learns the lesson. He places himself where the future becomes the present. End quote. With these lines, we return to the concrete utopianism of Whitman's poetry. Poetry does not strike at something timeless in the present, nor does it reproduce tradition. Instead, it discovers the future in the past and in the present. It realizes life not by transcending matter, but by opening a sight where the future becomes present. With this in mind, the Levi's jeans commercial stands in a new light. It is not the bastardization of Whitman's poetry, but its extension, its proliferation, and its realization, whether or not we want it. So let me now propose a second thesis. The afterlife of Whitman's poetry should not be understood as a series of deviations or betrayals, but as a process of absorption. Absorption is a bodily process and a material event of subjectivization. It names the conversions of body into poetry and of poetry into flesh, but it implies neither stasis nor repetition of the same. The event of the poem realizes itself only by way of its subsequent becomings, its variations, whose unity we may call its afterlife. This afterlife possesses a utopian charge insofar as it includes the idea of the future as the fulfillment of a textual corporeal desire, or in Whitman's terms, realization. So I want to turn now to another absorption of Whitman's leaves, Rob Halpern's 2012 collection of poetry, Music for Porn. And I tried to get an image of it. It's hard to get an image of the cover. The cover looks like a brown bag with the title and the author's name in small black print. If you take the cover off, which you can do, the jacket, there's a montage, or a collage rather, of images from gay pornography, so that essentially you have reduplicated the logic of the kind of porn and paper bag, which is also, in a way, a logic of the closet. I want to talk about this in a moment. I want to turn now to another absorption of Whitman's leaf, Halpern's 2012 collection of poetry and music for porn. The collection consists of prose poems, loosely structured verse, and experimental essays. Its central figure is the soldier, specifically the US soldier deployed in the Second Gulf War. The poems rework material from journalistic reports of military investigations. For example, articles from the New York Daily News on soldiers who have sustained brain injuries, and site reports from the White Horse detainment facility in Syria, Iraq. However, the thrust of the collection is not documentary, at least not in a narrow sense. Instead, it is allegorical. Indeed, Halpern describes the figure of the soldier as, and I quote, an allegory, mirror of ideology, from which there is no remove, a blank that both arouses and frustrates my longing for a livable world. At once portal and obstruction. So allegory in this context names both a poverty and a wealth. On the one hand, it entails an emptying out of sense, because figuration, the soldier as figure, rather than representation per se, cancels out concrete self-presence. On the other hand, allegory also involves an eruption of sense, a surplus of sense, since figuration implies a doubling of signification, a coordination of the manifest and the latent, the here and there, the now and then. Halpern claims that this oscillation between surplus and void constitutes the propulsive force of his collection. And I quote, music for porn emerged rather feebly in that blank. He's referring here to a blank or a bar that ended his previous collection, Rumored Place. As my writing began to seek the shape of what could not be felt there, the content of that form like the plenitude of a void. The plenitude of a void. The allegory taking place here does not amount to an invocation of one-to-one correspondences, nor does it elevate material forms to an ideal plane. This isn't Pilgrim's Progress. Instead, it speaks to Benjamin's more complex theory of allegory, articulated on the origin of German tragic drama, according to which allegory names a material practice predicated on ruins. And I should say that there are a number of citations of Benjamin within Music for Porn. Allegory gets defined as a network of relations among fragments. It implies a non-identity of an entity with itself, but also a web of correspondences between historical times. Whereas a romantic symbol designates a unity between ideal form and material landscape, allegory is signification in a time of disaster, a mode of gesturing that generates meanings only insofar as those meanings are wounded, broken, crippled. Music for porn is allegorical because the figure of the soldier that it deploys refers not only to the empirical reality of the Second Gulf War, but also to the long history of the wounded soldier in the US literary and political imagination. The figure of the soldier doubles the time of the present in and through the Civil War. Halpern absorbs, he cites, revises, rewrites, and comments on Whitman's drum taps. Most notably the poem Over the Carnage Rose Prophetic of Voice. So drum taps is Whitman's most notable Civil War poetry or collection of Civil War poetry. Halpern takes lines from it, rewrites lines in kind of successive permutations, but then performs what we would generally call literary criticism, except sometimes in the form of poetry throughout this collection. So in that well-known poem, Over the Carnage Rose Prophetic of Voice, Whitman proposes that neither paper nor arms can resolve the conflicts of the Civil War. What is needed, he writes, is affection. And I quote, "Over the carnage rose prophetic of voice. Be not disheartened, affection shall solve the problems of freedom. Yes, those who love each other shall become invincible. They shall yet make Columbia victorious." And Columbia is Columbia. The utopian impulse present in these lines bespeaks a militarized, nationalist, abstract utopia, a utopia of reconciliation in which the future, or freedom yet, incorporates difference and division into a transcendent body, the glorious feminine figure of Columbia victorious, mother of American democracy. At the same time, Whitman's drum taps includes poems such as Vigil Strange I Kept on the Field One Night, in which desire does not transcend corporeality, but sinks into the wounded bodies of war. The soldier's passage into death articulates itself as a mixture of melancholic longing and sweet remembrance, as the responding kisses to which the poem alludes, kisses shared between poet and soldier, linger on somewhere between past and present. For Whitman, even as the Civil War shatters the body politic and generates piles of wounded and dead soldiers, it also constitutes the multiplication and intensification of bodily pleasures. In biographical terms, serving as a nurse during the war, Whitman's practice of caring for young wounded men made available tactile pleasures, same-sex pleasures, that would not have otherwise been available. At the same time, it would be too simple to analyze these pleasures as if they were an accident of war, pure happenstance. For what is so striking in Whitman's wartime poems, and maybe so disconcerting as well, is that the wounds themselves become sites of pleasure. The material conditions for a touch in which pleasure and commonality, ecstasy and communion run together in a mode of social relation that exceeds, even as it requires, the state apparatus. In other words, injured bodies constitute the condition of possibility for imagining a society in which new kinds of pleasures are possible, at least for Whitman in this context. So there is then, in the war-torn Whitman, a writing of utopian praxis in which the national body finds its substance, its meat in the fallen body of the soldier. Halpern writes, Whitman's vision of a post-Civil War restored America, free and democratic, requires a very particular fallen body, my homo national, whose arrow silently fills the hushed space between my organs, otherwise drowned in unheard war noise. End quote. Lisa Dugan and Jasbir Poor have conducted incisive critiques of homo nationalism, understood as a normative liberal queerness that, far from challenging the heteronormative capitalist reproduction of the nation state, actually serves as its supplementary condition, and for that matter, its alibi. While I don't have the time to argue the point, I would contend, and I would not be the first to do so, that Whitman's corpus is split from beginning to end between a hyper-nationalist, hyper-capitalist homosociality and a counter-nationalist, anti-capitalist queerness. The trick is whether or not they ever become extricable from one another. Halpern's absorption of Whitman attempts to reappropriate Whitman's wartime affections. And I quote, "A bleeding guy in uniform, fallen guarantor of America's future. What feelings does this body conduct, and how might they be organized differently, if only to arouse Whitman's homoerotic affections, how otherwise to pervert them from the militarized ends, the police being the future of this democracy?" Question mark. One might say that Halpern immanentizes Whitman's utopian longings. He brings them back to the sensuous folds of the flesh, and in doing so enables a democratic, critical intelligence as attentive to violations against equality as to the triumphant procession of freedom. Concrete utopia entangles itself in abstract utopia as Halpern rediscovers radical democracy in the war-torn Nachleben of Whitman's corpus. However, such an interpretation of Halpern's poetry is too simple by far, ignoring the ambivalence of the desire animating his verse. There's on the one hand just the very facticity of Halpern's poetry being absorbed in the Second Gulf War, the way in which his desire for some kind of real democracy, some kind of utopian democracy, is bound up to the Second Gulf War. There isn't a blockage that inheres in music for porn, insofar as the collection itself is a product of history. Halpern's prose sections of the collection make evident that these conditions cannot be described solely as the omnipresence of war, for these conditions also include the neoliberal management of global markets, the shock doctrine, to use Naomi Klein's phrase, that translates disaster. In this context, utopia stumbles because the imagination can leap over its material conditions, only at the same time sacrificing the body. In short, you can have your vision of a demilitarized utopia, or you can have your imminent materialist critique, but you can't have both. Music for porn is riven by the anxiety that follows from this choice between dreaming after utopia and wrestling with biopolitical conditions. Halpern's collection also finds itself interrupted by an attraction to the very thing it disavows, namely the carnage of war. In the poem Great Armies of the Wounded, the devastation of the Second Gulf War becomes an occasion for erotic intensity. And I quote, "The war heats up. It offers worlds of feeling very deep, much deeper than defiance, all slain things being equal wealth, bodies fucked real deep inside, the nation's gorgeous booty." Halpern unfolds a dimension of Whitman's corpus that hides in the shadows of Columbia's robes, or where the death of democracy offers pleasures not on sale during peacetime. It offers a libidinal intensity in which existential meaning and the deepest fuck are identical to being fucked over. This eroticization of war is perhaps the inevitable consequence of a utopian aspiration that locates itself imminently in the conditions of the present. That utopian affect that Whitman elsewhere names adhesion, or manly love, cannot extricate itself from American exceptionalism. It can exist only ambivalently, as at one and the same time, the solution to democratic problems and the dissolution of democracy by its deathly double war. It'd be possible to stop here, admitting the frankest way that the utopian impulse that is Whitman's signature, his Nachleben, is irrevocably compromised. And it is. However, Halpern suggests yet another option, equally imminent, equally compromised, but for all that, neither fatalistic nor resigned. And I quote, "I want my writing to move in the fault where desire, the body, collides with those conditions, and where the poems might become sensory organs in the process of perceiving the situation in ways my mind can't yet conceive or sense." So Halpern articulates here a disjunction between the imagination of utopia and the bodily sensation of utopia, between a transcendental apparatus in which utopia secures itself as a teleological horizon and an affective vibration in which utopia trembles into being, making itself felt as a poignant longing for futurity. This utopian tremor does not offer a route around the compromised position in which Whitman and Halpern find themselves, but rather marks an excess of desire, of hope, of knowledge, irreducible to both their corpuses and the conditions from which their corpuses emerge. Halpern describes this situation in which utopia and history are split from one another, yet joined together in terms of a pornographic imagination. Now, riffing on Agamben's or Giorgio Agamben's writings on pornography, Halpern insists that porn is ambivalent. It's at one and the same time a tactic for regulating the social body and a tactic for liberation, for producing new kinds of bodies. The practice of utopia, its anticipation through the organs of poetry, cannot help but be a pornography, a writing of the prostituted body, the etymology of pornography, which is to say that the imminence of utopia implies its ambivalence. Its being at one and the same time, the saturation of bodies by state and capitalist controls, and the appearance of inassimilable bodies, of bodies that are figures for a future lived otherwise. So let me conclude my discussion of Halpern by briefly examining one of his poems that adheres more closely to the conventions of lyric poetry. This organ opens one to structure, mingles, or if one prefers, mangles, together queer eroticism and the wounds of war. And I quote, "The situation's pretty unstable, said my soldier with no hands, and I imagine his prosthetic up my ass, I love the feeling. I even quiver with the pleasure of being so near the goal." As you can see, this poem consists of two tercets, the first seemingly whole, the second broken, incomplete. The fragment that would complete the second stanza finds itself isolated, off kilter, in respect to the previous line breaks. The end dash that precedes this final fragment, so near the goal, can be taken as the equivalent in punctuation to the prosthetic enjoyment that the poem represents, or more precisely apostrophizes. The body of the poem is therefore a broken body, but the gap, the cut, the wound that divides it is the place where there can be sensed as an absence that sends forth material sparks of possibility, the unbearable pleasure of utopia. Utopia comes to obey a logic of queer prosthetics, an extension of being not only beyond a militant heteronormativity, but also beyond the one-sided, individualistic non-relationality of like capitalism. The wound, the amputated or broken lyric poem, unsettles the sutured together closure of the neoliberal entrepreneurial self. The mercenary out to make a killing. Instead of making a killing, instead of, as it were, accumulating literary wealth, this inelegant love song to a wounded soldier opens the possibility of a commonality, of a commons, in which a social vitality would arise from the wreckage of this ongoing disaster that we call the present. So I'll conclude with the third and final thesis. The utopian dimension of Whitman's Nachleben, which is to say the utopian electricity of his poetry's absorption, remains concrete or actual only insofar as it is also wounded, broken, prosthetic. If Whitman's afterlife cannot be summed up in the hymns of American exceptionalism, it is because in practices such as Halpern's poetry and Fukunaga's Levi's jeans commercial, the affirmation of utopia acquires substance in the wreckage of American exceptionalism. Such practices entail a linking of utopia not as after history, but as history's intimate or extimate double. In Halpern's words, this is what happens when liberation coincides with total destruction. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that talk, and we have a few minutes for conversation afterwards. I'd like to begin by asking a question about fidelity. And I can't help but think about the actual low fidelity quality of the sound recording of Whitman himself, and also the really sort of the low exposure of the film and its sort of darkness, right? And the fact that it's I think in black and white, although it's hard to tell, but here. And to think about basically, one way to think about this idea of the kind of the non-identity and kind of network of correspondence is that Whitmanian fidelity implies, right, is actually a low fidelity, right? A fidelity that is sort of bound up with its interferences. And I think that's, as a medium for transmission, as a medium for desire and immanence itself, right? It both can and can't carry the sort of auratic trace of the archaic past. It has to unfold. My question, if that is true, is whether or not the poetic version of, let's say, low fidelity that you're establishing as Whitmanian and Halpern as well, corresponds with sort of the abstract, concrete, political dimension, either sort of analogically, right, they are like one another, or whether poetry, the role of poetic transmission as low fidelity is actually situated as a medium within that very process. It's a very basic question somehow. But again, I'm just trying to think about sort of whether if we disaggregate sort of the political utopia and sort of the poetic utopia, and then reaggregate them, where did they sort of lock into one another? And is poetry the poetic a medium? And if so, does it extend to the commercial, to pants, right, as well? I mean, how far does the prosthetic go?
Right.
And it goes all the way in Halpern.
So, I mean, we have here a question of the way in which genre and medium are entangled, essentially, is how I would see your question. On the one hand, we have poetry as a genre that can also be a medium, and on the other hand, we also have a series of mediums. And the dividing line between the two is not exactly precise, and in fact, depends upon the event of specific poems and of their transmission, I would say. Part of what I'm trying to get at is the way in which I think Whitman, as a thinker of poetry as well as a poet, suggests a kind of, let's say, a mode of mediality, or just a mediality that is not only cross-generic, but is also cross-medium in the technological sense. And in this case, I like what you're saying about low fidelity, because, of course, it's all about static. It's all about the distinction between information and noise. And so often I feel like our procedure as critics is to displace or to get rid of noise. Both when we're teaching, when we're producing scholarship, our goal is to eliminate the noise to get at the information, even in a kind of post-hermeneutic modality of criticism. The goal is still, to some degree, a circumscription, not just of what counts as, quote-unquote, the poem, but what counts as a certain kind of fidelity that requires a negative process, even if it's only implicit, of getting rid of the noise. And I'm, of course, trying to bring out the noise. I'm trying to bring out the noise as itself evental, right? That there might be these moments of noise within not only the quote-unquote originals of the poetry, but both preceding them. I mean, one could talk about, and I'll have to talk about in the article version I work up, the fact that Whitman spent a lot of time in New Orleans writing journalism, right? That was one of his other, besides working for the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, he also worked for a New Orleans newspaper. And so to think about the way in which you see the early versions of Leaves of Grass, in fact, sort of appearing as moments of journalism and moments of observation of his journalism in his newspaper writing, and the way in which that. So what I guess I would say, Jonathan, and I hope I'm answering parts of your question at least because it's generous and complex, is on the one hand, I'm trying to get at a critical procedure that wouldn't be about eliminating noise. On the other hand, there is still something distinctive about poetry here. But I want to suggest that distinctiveness is contingent upon the reproduction of the genre, and that certain kinds of events of the poem, the aftermath of the poem, may not consist in reproducing the genre, may consist in abolishing it in another mode. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question about labor, which you mentioned, I mean, you talked about a little bit, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about it. Just because you mentioned, video sort of evokes or coincides with, Whitman's ethos of loafing, and I'm wondering if it's also picking up on sort of some certain anti-work strains of Occupy, and this way in which total crisis becomes a possibility for thinking about liberation from work, which of course is very problematic because that can also be easily co-opted into a sort of celebration of the precarity of labor, et cetera, et cetera. But then so that's one part, but then I'm also wondering how you would relate that to the 19th century and Whitman and, the aftermath of slavery, which obviously implies a total transformation of the very category of labor.
Okay, so...
That's a big question.
Yeah, no, it's great. The first part of your question, which you didn't answer, but you gave me everything I need but the answer, which is absolutely, there's a way in which we can read these in terms of kind of, whether it's post-autonomous Marxists or certain strands of anarchist theory as a refusal of labor politics in which idleness becomes, in fact, a politics in itself, a politics of bodies. And in the chapter of my book, that's precisely how I read Whitman, but part of my dissatisfaction with my own reading procedure there is not accounting in contemporary critical terms for the overlap or that point of indistinguishability between racialized, gendered, and sexualized modes of precarity in the contemporary global economy, especially that have arisen in the past, let's say, 40 years and have intensified since 2008. So part of it is thinking that overlap, of course, of unemployment and refusal of labor without reconciling them. The other aspect of your question, what happens to the labor of slaves here. I'll give a really brief answer because I need to think through it more. It's something I write about elsewhere. I haven't, for some reason, thought about it as much in this context. I'll say two things. One is I wonder about the overlap between military conscription and slavery. Not that they're identical by any means. They certainly don't obey the same racialized logic, but there is a whole history of being able to buy your way out of, to be able to buy a body double during the Civil War for yourself to serve your time. If you were wealthy enough, you could pay somebody else to serve for you during the Civil War when you were conscripted. So there's something there about doubled bodies and about the way in which labor can be sacrificed up for war that also reproduces not the conditions of slavery, but a certain logic of the body that it shares. The other thing I would note is, of course, we're dealing with New Orleans in part. And when we're dealing with New Orleans, we have to think about the way in which a history of slavery structured, in fact, the real estate market up until 2005, when the chance for new zoning actually enabled a displacement and a recreation of New Orleans geography, in a certain sense to abolish the history of slavery, to forget about it. So I guess that doesn't quite answer your questions, but it's maybe the way I would like to think about it in the future.
I'm just wondering, like, what is Whitman looking at, the ethos of voting, and like, what is this, how does that relate to slavery?
Right, and I guess part of it is this is where you have to recognize that this is the Nachleben and not the, I mean, there's still a disjunction here, right? And there is a deviation of the trail. So my question would not be, I guess, what is Whitman thinking? My question is, what is his afterlife doing with it? And so I think it just displaces the question a little bit. So, yeah.
That was great, thank you so much. There's a lot to process. But you're very much in the zone of disability aesthetics.
Yeah.
And that increasingly is coupled with debility politics, right? So disability aesthetics is all over the place here, right? That is to say, broken bodies as conduits, it's precisely perfection that can't be a conduit.
Exactly.
And I wondered if, you've thought about, there's one other thing that's going on in my head right now, and that's a distinction between embodiment and corporeality. And typically, in discussions of disability aesthetics, embodiment is epistemological, right? It's an experience that is made possible by disability. And it's a way of knowing, and it's kind of game, it's positive. And corporeality is sort of more kind of ontological, but it's kind of fleshly. So I'm wondering if you can think about, particularly both the Whitman and the Halpern, but if there's ways that you can think about this kind of poetry as an ethics of care that's rooted in disability aesthetics, and if that itself isn't a kind of way out of a utopian logjam.
Yes and no. So, I was all yes into that very last part because I'm not quite ready to get out of the logjam. I want to get out of the logjam, but I don't want to do it cheaply.
I'm not saying you want to get out of it, but
yeah.
it seems to illuminate.
Maybe. So there's two things here. One of the things I think that you're articulating so nicely here is the way in which, if we think through disability and debility, the question of utopia, it requires us to complicate or trouble what I would see as the long history of biopolitics endemic to both the genre of utopian literature and to utopian philosophizing. Which is to say, utopia has so often been about the good body as well as the good polis, right? And that's a problem, right? Because,
and that's what's so cool about Whitman is because he never subscribes to that.
No, there's such a, and especially when you get into the Civil War poetry, when you get into the ethos of care that is so much a part of it, that's about tending wounds, that's about being at that liminal moment between life and death, which is also a moment of, in certain cases, absolute debility, and also a moment that comes with disability and debility at the same time. And part of what I'm thinking here, there's a few things. One is this enables us to trouble certain utopian hermeneutics by saying we can't identify a utopian body with a good body, at least not in normative terms. Two, we also have to recognize that liminal space between debility and disability, where the latter tends to signify liberal politics of recognition that needs to be distinguished from debility. And here I'm thinking of Jesper Puar's recent essay that appeared in Borderlands, where she's talking about the Gaza Strip in particular, but about Palestine more generally, and the politics of debility there. What happens when debility cannot become disability? What happens when debility is a kind of, well, permanent accumulation of bodies?
The downside of horror is, as you might imagine, it completely negates a whole category of existence.
Right.
But it,
Right.
I mean, I think she's great, but
Yeah, no, but you have to be careful there, right? Because the question is, because I almost want to bring it back to, I don't think you can equate disability to a liberal politics of recognition. There have to be other kinds of disability. And I don't know if Jaspier
right, exactly.
thinks that.
And this is what you just illuminated with Whitman.
Right. And what I want to suggest here then is, it's not simply a disability aesthetics because you're putting it, there's an epistemology, there's a kind of knowledge production, but there's also a way of arranging a body that's non-normative, that also isn't utopian in the sense of acquiring a better body, because that whole teleology of the better body is itself, sort of play on Halpern, fucked up and fucked over, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so you get into the dangerous territory. And this is a dangerous territory because it is a territory of the fetish of eroticizing debility and disability.
Yeah.
But the question is if you can help but go there. And here I'm also thinking of Tim Dean from his essay Stunt, right? Which is a wonderful interrogation of pornography and disability and debility.
Yeah.
So I hope that...
Yeah, no, it's great. I'm glad you're seeing how well, like I always think of Haraway's line, why should the body end with the skin? This is exactly a poetics of that.
Exactly.
We have time for one more question. Micah?
Yeah, so I have a question about the distinction that you're making following the block between the abstract utopia, which serves to concretize the status quo or to reinforce it or even to rescue it if it's drowning, right? Think about the Levi's convention. And then the concrete utopia, which opens up or anticipates ways of being otherwise, right? And I guess the question I have is the way in which that reintroduces Karl Mannheim's older distinction between ideology and utopia, ideology which serves to reinforce the status quo, utopia which strives to blow it up, but then more kind of specifically Paul Ricoeur's reading of Mannheim's distinction, where, like you, he'll say that there is no outside the logjam, right? That you're always inside of that logjam, and that that's the space that has to then become an ongoing opportunity to critique the utopia. Which it sounds like your work is kind of doing. So the question about reintroducing this distinction, albeit with slightly different terms, and then whether or not Paul Ricoeur's reading of that distinction kind of pertains to your work.
It does. It's been over 10 years since I've read Mannheim or Ricoeur, I have to admit, so there's that. But I think I can still speak to the question pretty well, because that distinction between concrete and abstract utopia in Bloch and the principle of hope, it is a questionable distinction. You know, somebody like Ruth Levitas in the collection Not Yet, which is I think by Tom Rowland, will just flat out say it's a polemical distinction. It's a distinction whose content can only ever be a contingent politics. And for her, that in a certain sense eradicates the distinction itself. It eradicates the analytical value. But I go the exact opposite direction. I say, yes, you're right, absolutely. The distinction between concrete utopia and abstract utopia can only be polemical, can only be a matter of political situation. Exactly, which is its analytical value, in fact. Its analytical value is that it's predicated upon not only a text, but the production of a certain kind of subjectivity. And from that mode, what I want to suggest is kind of eventual logic, is that if, as I'm arguing, the reading of the poem becomes itself a mode of corporeal process, right? A way of embodiment, way of being in the world. If that's the case, then there is no resolving that distinction between concrete and abstract in the text itself. It's only in the afterlife of the text, and that afterlife can extend not only into cultural production, but also into politics. And for me, I am invested in the concept of utopia, for better or worse. I've been critiqued for it, I've been pat on the back for it when I go to the Utopian Studies conference, I guess. But it's a dangerous concept, and it's one that can do as much work as an alibi as anything else, as a critical concept, as an analytical value, as polemical strategy. But I think there is something there, but I only think there's something there if you admit, as you put it, that there is no outside to power. There is no outside even to what we might call governance. There are only other ways of arranging life, other ways of relating to power. That might be egalitarian and not hierarchical.
Great, we're out of time. Please join me in thanking Christian Haines.